Thank you very much. Thank you very much to Kita for having me. I unfortunately agree with the two previous speakers that I don't see a lot of change, and the overall message from the midterms and in general, I think, is one of a bit of pessimism in terms of trying to find a quick resolution to the U.S.-China trade war. I think the previous speakers focused particularly on sort of the relationship between Korea and the U.S. I'm going to focus a bit more on the bilateral China-U.S. issues and think about how Korean companies and the Korean market sort of fit into that. We'll wait for this to work, but you all have the presentation in front of you, so I'm happy to walk through that. A couple of key quick thoughts. First, as you're kind of watching this horse race, if you will, play out, I think it's important to understand, we've talked about the Trump administration, but there are many different elements inside the Trump administration and inside Washington, D.C. more generally, that I think it's important to understand and think about their incentives and what they really want. So the title of my talk, I was asked to talk about what the U.S. wants. Well, it's not that simple because there are a lot of different constituencies in the U.S. and they all want different things. So I'll go through some of those. Secondly, the ultimate goal of the administration at this point is really a decoupling of the U.S. economies, or the U.S. and Chinese economies. And so that does not bode well for a particularly quick resolution to this conflict. I'll touch a little bit on the fact that there's more than just trade at stake here, and so that too, besides the fact that there are many different constituencies wanting different outcomes, the fact that there's more than just trade involved will be important as well. And then finally, I'll talk about some of the outcomes for Korean businesses. I think in the short term, actually, there are some positives in terms of the U.S.-China relationship and what that means for Korean businesses. In the longer term, I see more challenges. So what is thinking about what the U.S. wants? I think one important illustration, which Mr. Eikenson talked about, is that this is not just about Donald Trump. I see Donald Trump as an accelerant of the challenges in the U.S.-China trade relationship and economic relationship more broadly. He's not a cause. He just sort of popularized the issue a little bit more and was a catalyst to sort of bring these issues to the fore. So when we think about Trump, an important thing to think about is that the challenges between China and the U.S. are one of the few bipartisan issues in Washington, D.C. right now. That's another reason that the U.S. midterms didn't make that big of an impact, is because everyone on the U.S. side is frustrated with China. And so getting more Democrats or fewer Democrats or more Republicans or fewer Republicans doesn't really change that fact. And increasingly, this is also a global issue, right? It's not just that everyone in Washington is frustrated with Beijing. Everyone in Brussels, everyone in Canberra, everyone in Seoul is increasingly frustrated with Beijing's trade practices. So the Chinese are just starting to learn that, and it's calibrating how they're reacting. So going through the U.S. administration, there are different areas here. I want to first talk about President Trump. President Trump is very much focused on the trade aspect, and specifically focused on the fact that China has a very large trade surplus with the U.S. This is arguably the president's longest-held policy belief. He's been talking about China ripping us off for decades, same with Japan back in the 80s. So the president has obviously had a proclivity to change policy positions, but this is one of the few that he's been focused on for a long time. And at first, the direct bilateral trade surplus was really dominating the discussion, the negotiations between China and the U.S., because they heard the president saying it, and they thought, okay, if we promise to bring down the trade surplus, then the president will be happy. Well, it ends up there's a lot of other constituencies out there that are interested in other things. And I will say, from an overall growth standpoint, if you look at the macro numbers, the Chinese are willing, it's the issue the surplus issue is the one that they're most willing to move on because it has actually the least impact on their economy. Yes, they are a trading nation, but I have a chart in here. If you look at the chart on trade, we've seen a drop-off in U.S. Or Chinese exports to the U.S. before, and it has a very minimal, so this was back 2006, 2007, it has a very minimal impact on overall trade growth out of China. In fact, if Chinese trade growth went to, if Chinese export growth to the U.S. went to 0, it would only knock about 2.5 percentage points off of total Chinese export growth. So from a macro standpoint, you're not talking about that big of an issue. Point being, what Donald Trump is focused on, the bilateral trade surplus, China's most willing to give on, but we've now sort of moved away from that. So what is the focus of other elements in the administration? Secondly is you have the USTR, Robert Lighthizer. Perfect. Robert Lighthizer, I think, is the key to watch in the U.S. as this drama unfolds. The Chinese had a little bit of trouble figuring out who to talk to on the U.S. side, as many other countries have. In the early days of the administration, partly because certain positions weren't filled, but also because there was a lot of jockeying within the administration to be the point person. And in particular, the Chinese have been used to dealing with the American Treasury basically since 2006, since the SNED, the Strategic Economic Dialogue, was established. But that dialogue process, the reason that Treasury was able to negotiate on trade issues was because they were representing a group of American regulators, including the USTR. Since the Trump administration has come into power, that SNED, what was the SED, became the S&ED under Obama, and then became the CED, the Comprehensive Economic Dialogue, under Trump. The Comprehensive Economic Dialogue has broken down, and so Treasury and USTR are not really negotiating together anymore, and because USTR is the only legal entity in the U.S. with legal responsibility to negotiate on trade, the Chinese have been negotiating with Treasury, who's not sitting with USTR at the table, and have not understood that Treasury actually doesn't have the power that they think that Treasury actually has on trade issues. So China has finally woken up to the fact that it's actually the USTR that matters, and what Robert Lighthizer is doing is the most important. And he, even as there were early negotiations back and forth, while Steve Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, was quite willing to try to find a deal, very quietly was pushing forward his agenda, which is not really focused on trade. It's focused on intellectual property and industrial policy. And he is just using these 301 cases as a tool to affect Chinese industrial policy. He really wants to upend the entire way the Chinese economy works. And so his goal, like Trump just wants to narrow the trade surplus, USTR Lighthizer really is thinking about industrial policy and intellectual property theft. And so that's what he wants, and it's what large parts of the administration want, and I think it's important to keep an eye on him. Congress has already been talked about quite a bit. As Mr. Atkinson said, trade wasn't that big of an issue in the election, and I actually see Congress has focused more on the investment side of the U.S.-China relationship. Yes, they're thinking about trade, but they're really more worried about Chinese investment into the U.S. and trying to calibrate that and make sure it doesn't trip various national security protocols. So that's where they're focused on, reforming CFIUS, et cetera. And I think the point here, as you're, I think, probably beginning to see, is that we're seeing a proliferation of asks or desires from the U.S. side. And this is living in Beijing and seeing how things are playing out there, obviously frustrating to the Chinese negotiators. Finally, you have U.S. businesses who are want a totally different thing. They want more access to the Chinese market. This is the same thing they've wanted for decades, right? They're arguing on behalf of, or through the administration and directly to Chinese regulators for more market access. And we've seen a little bit more market access in response to by the Chinese in response to the trade tensions and the overall economic tensions from Trump. But the problem is that this is incompatible with what the broader Washington establishment wants. In fact, I hear a lot when I talk to U.S. diplomats and U.S. policymakers that American businesses don't really know what's good for them right now, and that they're going against their own economic interests by ceding intellectual property, by investing more and more in the Chinese economy, and ultimately, the U.S.'s goal is to decouple the economies completely, at least in terms of certain sectors, right? They want the semiconductor industry to be pulled out of China, the entire supply chain. So they want other national security related sectors to be, the supply chain to be totally moved out of China. That's obviously at odds with American business interests. And I think it's something for Korean businesses to consider, because there's sort of two implications of this. One, it makes it clear that if that's the U.S.'s goal, a negotiated outcome on trade doesn't solve any of the structural issues in the relationship, and it would be a short-term stopgap in the economic tensions. Secondly, it tells us that these tensions are going to be around for a while. And thirdly, it means that, you know, potentially we could upend supply chains in Asia, and I think that obviously has huge implications for Korean businesses, especially as Chinese companies increasingly become your competitors. So the other thing about this decoupling issue is, like I said, the president is focused on just trade, but what he has done is he has enabled a lot of pent-up frustration, as I see it, in the U.S. establishment with China. So you have individuals, for example, in the Department of Defense talking about Chinese industrial policy and Chinese trade policy in a way they never did before. So there's been a coalescing in the U.S. establishment of the fact that China is really more of a strategic competitor. And in fact, let me skip ahead a bit. I would say that if you look at these last 2 points here, Vice President Pence's speech a couple of months ago, 6 weeks ago, on the strategic competition between the U.S. and China, I think was a watershed. And that's really how, in my view, we should be thinking about the trade tensions as one piece of what is really a broader puzzle. And on the flip side, we've heard the Chinese talking more and more about a new Cold War and bracing to try to increase their economic self-sufficiency. Again, I hate to be pessimistic, but this is not a recipe for a quick resolution because of a friendly meeting between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump in Argentina at the end of this month. So I think it's important, again, just to recap a bit, to understand that the U.S. side, the desires or the motivations have proliferated. The way that that's been resolved is under this idea of strategic economic competition with China. Under that umbrella, you can say, yeah, well, we don't like the trade surplus. Under that umbrella, you can say, yeah, we don't want China investing so much in the U.S. Under that umbrella, you can say, we want to decouple the economies. Under that umbrella, it's a little bit harder to say we want, as the American business community, we want to invest there. But that's become the overarching framework. And that's, I think, how we need to be viewing this, particularly from the U.S. side. I think I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to make a couple other quick comments. One is in terms of the likely outcome. I think Mr. Atkinson talked about this as well, is that really, since we haven't seen most of the trade issues show up in the macro numbers, for even a short-term resolution, it's my feeling that on that second point, we're going to need some pain, both economies to feel some pain, before a recalibration can occur. And so what I consult with multinational companies operating in China and with investors. And what I always tell them is to look through the noise. What the picture I just painted is a long-term, multi-decade, the beginning of a long-term, multi-decade strategic competition. The markets move on the rumor of whether or not Xi and Trump are going to meet, and that's just noise. This is the issue that we need to be thinking about, the long-term strategic competition. But if you're looking for some sort of optimism, once we see the pain start to show up in, say, late Q1 of next year, in terms of the exports or trade between the U.S. and China, the numbers will finally start to show up. It might be enough to push Trump politically if he's vulnerable among some of the Midwest states. I think it's very hard for me to see a back down on the Chinese side. We'll hear from our Chinese colleagues here in a minute, because they see this as a strategic encirclement by the U.S., and they're in it for the long haul. So again, it's very hard to see a negotiated outcome, but if you're looking for one, look Q2 of next year after we start to see some of this pain. Finally, for Korean businesses, I would say in the short term, you're looking at some potential positives. As Professor Lee just spoke about, the relationship with the U.S. is going to remain tense. But in terms of looking at China, I mean, China, in response, is actively reducing import tariffs, so potential to export more to China in the short term. Also, there's this renewed energy around the local, the trilateral talks between Korea, Japan, and China. China has major interest in trying to push that forward. You would have seen there's been a bit of relaxation or thawing of relationships between China and Japan. And it's led to legitimate market access openings by China. So Korean companies in the auto space and the finance space can take advantage of those. My final point here is on the long-term challenges, 3 quick points. 1, China is emphasizing self-reliance, specifically in technology. That means it wants a chip industry. That means it wants to compete with Korean companies in this space. We don't know if they're going to be successful to do it, successfully be able to move up the value chain, but China is becoming much more of a competitor in this key space where Korea has been very successful for many years. Secondly, and then the second and third points I think are related. For any business that does business with another country, there's 2 key concerns to me. One is the creeping growth of national security concerns. Donald Trump talks about the entire U.S. economy in terms of national security. Many of the trade-related actions have been articulated along national security lines. I think third-party countries like Korea, and China's doing the same. China thinks of its economy as through the lens of national security. Third-party countries like Korea need to stand up and say, we need to draw some clear lines here, because otherwise eventually everything's going to be national security and you can't do global business. Secondly, the changing cybersecurity space. Trade is not just about selling goods anymore. It's about owning the data on the trade and services, on the trade in goods that you're doing, and then using the data to find new customers or whatever. The world is fracturing in terms of how different countries are thinking about their cybersecurity and data flows, and these are all the long-term challenges for Korean companies, in my view, in terms of the bilateral tensions between the U.S. and China. So I'll leave it there, looking forward to comments, and hope I haven't gone over too much on my time. Thank you.